Hi, and welcome back to Divine Dissident. Today we continue our dive into church history and the bias of the church fathers against women. If you missed the last video, I'll share a few quotes to catch you up to speed. Tertullian said, "Woman is a temple built over a sewer. And do you not know that you are each an Eve? The sentence of God on the sex of yours lives in this age. The guilt must of necessity live too. You are the devil's gateway. You are the unsealer of that forbidden tree. You are the first deserter of the divine law. You are she who persuaded him whom the devil was not valiant enough to attack. You destroyed so easily God's image, man. On account of your desert, that is death, even the Son of God had to die." These are harsh words, all put on women, identifying man as the image of God, not including women, blaming women for Adam's sin, and blaming women for the death of God's own son. Extreme. Very extreme. These are extreme ideas, sexist ideas not found in the Bible. Now, Thomas Aquinas' teacher, Albert the Great, filled Thomas's mind with dreadful ideas about women. He said, "Woman is a misbegotten man, and has a faulty and defective nature in comparison to his. Therefore she is unsure of herself. What she cannot get, she seeks to obtain through lying and diabolical deceptions. And so, one must be on guard with every woman, as if she were a poisonous snake and a horned devil. In evil and perverse doings, she may be cleverer, that is, slyer than man. Her feelings drive her towards every evil, just as reason impels man toward all good." So women were shown to be evil and men mostly good. Men were superior and women inferior. These were the ideas and beliefs of the culture and became part of church theology. These ideas did not come from the Bible. We should know better today. But back then, it was the accepted norm. What was it like for Christian women in these times? Let me share with you some excerpts from How God Sees Women by Taryn Williams. I'm just going to paraphrase some of the ideas in this book. Women's sexuality was viewed as inherent sinfulness. What purpose did women have in this culture and society other than reproduction? What was said to be her purpose was also sinful. Women who wanted to be holy and please God were forced into lives of celibacy. The historian Palladius, who lived 386 to 430 CE, tells of 20,000 women living in poverty, chastity, and solitude as hermits in the deserts around Egypt, apparently struggling under their castigated sex. They took vows of celibacy, poverty, and service in monasteries. In this culture, the godliest women avoided marriage. And if they were married, they avoided sex, if that was possible, and made themselves as unattractive as they could. What a sad life for women. Up until the Reformation, the best hope a woman had of being seen as godly was to avoid sex and domestic roles altogether. As nuns, they could be educated and experience some kind of independence, and a few would be promoted to be an abbess of a female monastery. Medieval history tells of men spiritually hating these kinds of women. Having abandoned domestic roles for the sake of Christ, there were women who spoke up for Christ with a voice that rang with the spiritual authority that only men had previously possessed. Outside of these gender-renouncing spiritual roles, there was only servitude and shame for women. Clement in the 2nd century said, "For women, The very consciousness of their own nature must evoke feelings of shame. All because the church fathers had answered the question of how God sees women incorrectly, reading their culture's sexist assumptions into the biblical texts. Now, later on came the witch hunts. Little was needed to identify and condemn a witch, a woman who simply did not recognize her subordinate status could be condemned to death. One abbot of a male monastery showed little sympathy for so easily demonized women. He said, "The wickedness of women is greater than all other wickedness in the world. The poison of dragons is more curable and less dangerous to men than the familiarity of women. For the safety of our souls, we will avoid them like poisonous animals." Then came the Reformation. Luther and Calvin overturned 14 years of church history, undermining the spiritual value of celibacy and celebrating sex and marriage. Christian women were now honored as wives, mothers, and household leaders. The pastor's wife became a new calling with spiritual dignity. However, even with some positive changes, most sexist teachings remained. Eve's sin still made women's role a subordinate one. Protestants passed a marriage ordinance that stressed wifely obedience. Martin Luther also made the woman's calling the home, not the church or wider society. Even after the Reformation, the idea of female inferiority remained intact, and the brutal witch hunt swept across Europe and America in the 15th to 17th centuries, evidencing that the church did not reform its low view of women. An edict of Pope Innocent VIII in 1484 to prosecute witches led to the execution of some 200,000 falsely accused women in the decades that followed. The theologians who supported this order wrote a document called Hammer of Witches to explain why women were so inclined to hand themselves over to the devil. They were impressionable, had slippery tongues, and were made, after all, from a bent rib. Since through this defect, the bent rib, she is the imperfect animal she always deceives. All witchcraft comes from carnal lust, which in women is insatiable. Interesting how people could view women created in the image of God like animals, like evil animals. It is interesting to note on how views of sex have changed over the years. Today in church, women are seen as the ones who are not very interested in sex, while men are prone to insatiable sexual impulse and addiction. The Enlightenment thinkers, while promoting ideas of the universal equality of all people, did little to help the plight of women. Jean-Jacques Rousseau said women's entire education should be planned in relation to men, to please them, to be useful to them, to win their love and respect. These are women's duties in all ages, and these are what should be taught from childhood on. Immanuel Kant also clarified that a husband had the right to possess his wife, and a wife's duty to obey her husband is a demand of natural law as well as a moral obligation. These were the cultural and worldly views of the time. The church today claims that it's trying to be different than the world, that it's fighting worldly feminism and trying to protect the family, etc. But is that really the case? For almost 2,000 years, the church skipped hand in hand with the world on its view of women. While it could have spoken up and raised women out of oppression, while it could have rejected treatment of women as inferior creatures, the church did not. They capitalized on it. This should grieve our souls. The church had the Word of God, a gold mine of equalizing power. The church could have easily looked at the way that Jesus treated women and uplifted women. But the church did nothing but subject and oppress women right along with the world. And later on, when culture and society finally started to realize this as evil and wrong, what did the church do? They doubled down. Even when the world was ready to accept that they were wrong and to accept change and to treat women differently, the church at large did not want to. In the 1800s, the seeds of change were planted and the rise of women began. Women have pushed back on their inferiority, subordination, and domestic roles that have been their lot since day dot. Church history has typically limited the scripture's ideas of freedom to personal salvation, but over time, this came to include social and political freedoms. This is why Christians were at the forefront of the abolition of slavery and for democracy, workers' rights, universal suffrage, racial equality, and equality for women in the workplace. Women gaining the right to vote was a huge triumph, dignifying women. The earliest suffragists were mostly Christian. The women's liberation as it bloomed in the 1960s had deep biblical and evangelical roots. Christians often vilify feminism and use it as an accusatory label, but the term feminism at its roots was about being treated as an equal person and not being oppressed simply for being female. According to the traditional definition, to be anti-feminist would mean to be against women being treated as equal persons and to be for female oppression and discrimination simply due to their sex. And I don't think most people truly believe that. Today, people's view of what feminism means varies so widely, and it can be difficult to really understand what a person is talking about when they use the term. But for the great majority of Christians, feminism has nothing to do with hating men or being exactly the same as men. It has everything to do with a healthy view of freedom and equality amongst our fellow human beings. By the 1960s and 70s, women had won their greatest freedoms. For 200 years, women fought the battle to get where we are today. These women were brave, and because of them, women enjoy equal status today. Instead of celebrating women's newfound freedom and dignity, the church fought back and continues to fight back. As we have seen in this video and in the previous video, the church's historical position was that women could not lead in the church or at home because they were inferior. They were incapable, weak, and did not possess the intelligence that men did. Now, the church tried to buckle down on their historical view. John Rice, in his book called Bobbed Hair, Bossy Wives, and Women Preachers, wrote, "Man is made in the image of God. God is a masculine God. The masculine pronoun is used of God everywhere in the Bible. God is not effeminate. And man is made in the image of God. On the other hand, a woman is in the image and a mate to man. Blessed is the woman that remembers this. Her glory is being a help to the man and in submission to her father or her husband." Many pastors tried to defend the historical view and make wild claims that the family was under attack. Egalitarian marriages that society was now espousing were seen as an overthrow of Christian marriage, in which people believed the Bible's main teaching regarding marriage was authority submission. I have to laugh at this now because I recently made a trip to Washington, D.C. with my family and my husband. We visited the National Archives, and I got to see the real articles and advertisements from the early 1900s up until the time of the women's liberation movement of the 60s and 70s. It was really exciting looking at the history, and something really stuck out to me. The arguments against all of these women's freedoms, including women's right to vote, looked exactly the same as the arguments against women preachers and egalitarian marriages today. extreme, sensationalized, fear-based arguments. Women voting would destroy the country. I saw one article where the wife was getting ready to head out the door to go vote, and the husband was sitting at the kitchen table pouting next to two small children. It read something like, "Wives will leave their husbands alone with the children to go vote." Wow, how awful. What man would know what to do being left alone with his own children for an hour or two? Unbelievable. I'd like to read a few pages from this book for you guys because I feel like this sums everything up really well. So, until the 1960s, says complementarian scholar Daniel Doriani, theologians assumed female ontological inferiority. Theologians, clergy, and everyone else until this time generally saw women as inferior and men as superior. They argued that the Bible said as much. As late as 1957, the evangelical Donald Guthrie, in his Tyndale commentary on 1 Timothy, opined, "The priority of man's creation places him in a position of superiority over women, and that there is a greater aptitude of the weaker sex to be led astray." Renowned biblical scholar Charles Ryrie reached a similar conclusion in 1958. "The mind of God concerning women," he said, "will mean subordination and honor in the home, silence and helpfulness in the church." But then a new question was thrust upon the church. What does God have to say about this unprecedented rise in women in society, a social movement which has claimed the full equality of men and women? For a short while, the church circled the wagons around its historical doctrine. Yet, despite an initial clash with culture on the issue of gender equality, a wonderful realization settled upon much of the church in the 1960s through the 1990s. Wait, we got it wrong. Women are equal to men. This is still one of the most dramatic shifts in the history of Christian theology. The church had for centuries echoed patriarchal and misogynist cultures, reading those attitudes and ideas into the biblical text. But now, thanks to a major cultural shift and pioneering persistent Christians among them, the church went back to the biblical text and found that there actually was so much in the Bible that affirmed women's essential equality. Tim Keller, as I quoted earlier, says, "More often than not, interactions with a new culture shows us many things taught in the Bible, things we either missed altogether or thought unimportant, possibly even in ways in which we misread the Bible through the lens of our own cultural assumptions." And so, read more carefully, the Bible did not, after all, teach that women were less rational or more susceptible to sin or incapable of leadership, or unable to work outside the home. Though the seeds of a woman's equality were in the scriptures and surfaced only momentarily in the history of the church, it was only recently that the church finally and formally began to widely and proudly embrace this equality as a matter of church doctrine. Anyone who took this as a starting point was now part of a brand new day in Christian theology regarding women, a break from the millennia-long theology of the church. Now, if you are surprised to see the church coming to clarity on a topic or changing its mind, this is how it has always been throughout history. When people believed that the world was flat, theologians taught this from the Bible. When people believed that the sun revolved around the earth, biblical texts proved as much. Similarly, society's abolishing of slavery and overcoming of anti-Semitism have involved the church's reading the biblical text in a new and better way, as we make new discoveries that shed light. We need to see what is actually there and not there in the scriptures. The same can be said for the discovery in wider society that women were essentially equal to men. Lo and behold, the Bible did speak of the substantial equality of the two sexes in creation and in Christ. It was there all along. The Catholic Church, though initially banning against the equality of women, changed their theology too in 1987. Pope John Paul insisted on men's and women's essential equality. Now, evangelical churches, paralleling the Catholic example, a few brave souls came out boldly in support of women's liberation, arguing that the full equality and mutuality of men and women in the church, home, and society is what the Bible had always envisioned. However, and that is why this book must be written, they were opposed by other evangelicals who, though also rejecting the historical teaching of the church about female inferiority, sought to uphold a form of female subordination nonetheless. What followed was a debate lasting for decades between these two groups, the hierarchists and the mutualists, both equally devoted to the scriptures, evidenced in a plethora of books written in response to each other by both male and female authors on both sides. So, here's the thing. Both views were brand new at the time. The historical view that women were inferior had been tossed out the window. What followed was a debate lasting decades between these two groups, the hierarchists and the mutualists, both equally devoted to the scriptures. Having agreed to throw out the idea of female inferiority from its doctrines, these two groups took two different roads. So that today, some denominations espouse the one, while others adopt the second. Here's the key point. Both views were brand new in the history of the church. Patriarchalists swapped out the previous doctrine that women were inferior and thus subordinate to men with women are not inferior, women are equal, yet nonetheless still subordinate to men, while the mutualists opted instead for women are equal and thus not subordinate to men. The conversation, heated at times and cordial at others, continued until 1987. Then something happened in the U.S. that I believe illegitimately brought the conversation to a premature end. The Danvers Statement, with its new teaching called complementarianism, was formulated. So popular has this teaching become that it has been argued by many evangelicals to be the winner of the debate. Of course, this view may have triumphed because it's correct, but if we know anything about church history, it is also possible to win for other reasons. So, we have now looked at church history all the way up to 1987. The church was in crisis because the historical view was being rejected, and some people were adopting the egalitarian view. The hierarchists or patriarchists saw this as a threat, but a threat to what exactly? Tradition? Male authority? Competition for their jobs? The possibility of a woman being in leadership? Losing control? Was it really just about the Bible and the family? We have to remember that most of these men at the time had truly believed that women were inferior to them. It would be unlikely that all of a sudden these degrading views of women just disappeared among evangelical Christians and church culture. It's about as likely to just disappear as racism disappeared with the abolition of slavery. Horrible things still happen to people of color for a long time, and racism still endures. Misogyny still endures, and especially still in religious circles. We need to take this into account. Were they really looking to understand what the Bible said and what was God's heart and desire for women? Or were they just looking for anything in the Bible that might support their desire to keep women subjugated and under the authority of men? Were they just looking for a different reason to prevent women from leading? Were they just trying to find a solution to the problem of egalitarianism? Were they still finding a way to uphold women's equality while still getting the same historical result, female subordination? We cannot read minds, but we can try to gather as much information as possible that might give us some insight, just as we have looked at historical evidence throughout this video and the previous one. Remember that women throughout history have had little to no say on what role they get to play. It has almost always been interpreted and decided by men. Complementarianism was created by men. We need to ask ourselves who benefits from complementarianism. Women have been falsely characterized throughout all of history and their voices ignored or silenced. Unfortunately, this is still happening today. If you have enjoyed this content, please take the time to like and subscribe. And if you would like to support this ministry, please look down in the description for links to my Patreon and to my website, where there are various ways that you can support this ministry. Thank you so much for watching. We will continue this study, and I hope that has been helpful for you.